So I am David Freeman Engstrom. I'm a professor here at the law school and also an advisor to SAILS. And I want to kick things off by offering a warm welcome and just a few remarks before I have to rush off and go get ready to jump on a plane early this afternoon. So unfortunately, I won't be able to stick around. But I would like to just start things off with a couple of brief notes. Here's the first, which is I don't have to tell you that the topic of today's conference is an important one, but I will anyway, and I'll do it from my own little part of the AI sandbox. So I have spent this year working on a wonderfully rewarding project with a couple of my colleagues, Dan Ho and also Tino Cuellar here at the law school. And we're advising the federal government on AI use by federal administrative agencies. So think the SEC or the EPA. But a big part of the project is focusing on a different kind of agency, what are sometimes called mass adjudicatory agencies. And so these are agencies like the Social Security Administration or the Board of Veterans' Appeals. These are incredibly important agencies because they handle literally millions of cases for people who often have quite desperate needs. And yet there are some big problems with these mass adjudicatory agencies. If you look across the judges who have to decide these incredibly important cases, there are very large disparities in decision making. There are some judges within the immigration courts or within the Social Security Administration or the BVA, again, these mass adjudicatory agencies that award benefits, so disability benefits or asylum, 5% of the time. And there's some judges who award those benefits 95% of the time. And so it's clear that something other than the merits of those cases are actually driving the decision making. There are also massive backlogs, hundreds of thousands of cases within these agencies waiting to be decided. And so sometimes these people who have desperate needs have to wait a couple of years for their appeal to make it all the way through the system. And so part of our project has been to study and also even to help develop some tools within these mass adjudicatory agencies that can help solve some of those problems. And let me just give you one small example. I could trot out a series of tools that we think could make some progress on this front, but let me just give you one tool. There's a tool in use at the Social Security Administration that tries to identify easy grants. Cases where the agency is clearly going to grant disability benefits eventually, and those cases can then be pushed to staff-level decision makers for expedited review. So think of the promise of this kind of tool in terms of serving these people with these desperate needs. Could lead to quicker determinations for people who are ultimately going to get benefits. It also frees up time and resources for the agency to spend time on the tougher cases, to decide the more difficult cases for people who are in desperate need of these benefits. We even think it's possible that by dealing with the backlog problem with these agencies, that we could see a revival of a constitutional value that's been missing from this entire area of law, which is the constitutional value of dignity. The doctrine has pushed really hard in the direction of thinking in terms of the accuracy of decision making within these agencies, and left behind is the basic opportunity to be heard, right? The idea that someone should be allowed to tell their story and as a procedural justice matter feel like they are being attended to by this government agency, even if they are ultimately denied benefits. This is the promise of these kinds of tools, these use of these AI tools by government agencies, but there's also some peril there as well. If you look underneath the hood of this tool, you learn that the easy grant process is only available for someone who files electronically, not someone who files via pencil and paper. And so it's possible that this is available to the relative haves of the world rather than the have-nots. It's even possible that this tool and its use has a disparate impact on the basis of race or ethnicity. So here's the first point I want to make then, which is maximizing the promise and minimizing the peril of these sorts of tools in the public sector AI use, but also across the board when we think about how AI is intersecting with our society, is precisely the kind of work that Stanford, with its mix of a world-class law school, a world-class engineering quad, and its ability to convene gatherings like this one can and should be doing. And so I'm so glad to see so many people here today who want to take part in that conversation and want to try to drive that project forward. Here's the second point I want to make. I am currently serving as an associate dean here at the law school, and I've spent roughly the last year thinking about, talking about what the law school and also Stanford University more generally should be doing in the law and tech space over the next 10 years. And I have endless conversations and meetings where we talk about what faculty leadership do we need to drive forward a powerful research and teaching agenda in the law and tech space. But the savvier participants in those meetings, they ask a different question. Just how can we leverage the untold riches of our amazing and talented students at Stanford? And this conference, which is entirely student planned and executed, I think is a testament to that notion. And so as part of my welcome here, I want to be sure that I say congratulations to the student organizers at SAILS, and so that would include Marlena and Steinen and Alex, and I'm sure many others who I won't name here, for putting all of this together and for providing us an opportunity to have such an exciting and important set of conversations. So welcome again to all. I'm so very sorry that I cannot stick around and to take part in all of this, but I did really want to be here just for a few moments to say this welcome and to ensure that proper congratulations were given. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much to Stanford Law School and to SAILS and to Marlena and to everyone who's been part of making today possible. I think it's incredibly exciting to see who's in the space and to have a chance to have this conversation this morning. I wanted to start, let's see if I can, there we go. I want to start by talking a little bit about some of the social context around artificial intelligence as just a floor to what we'll be speaking about today. In October of 2015, I traveled with a few other researchers from UC Berkeley to northern Uganda. Our mission was to assess a girls' school that had been opened about a decade earlier to address the needs of young girls and women who had been abducted by the Lord's Resistance Army, had escaped from that army, and often returned to their home communities either pregnant or with young babies in tow. Unfortunately, given the poverty of the region to which they were returning, their families wouldn't take them in. The girls were no longer marriageable because they had already had sexual relations, and so they were largely on their own. Into that void stepped a number of major funders after our center did research into the needs of these young women. The funders pulled together and created a girls' academy called Padera Girls Academy in the northern regions of Uganda. The assessment, I had been asked 10 years later to come and do an assessment of how this school was playing out in practice to see if it was something that should be replicated for the future. We held a number of focus groups and did interviews with teachers, with administrators, with the girls, and with the young children themselves. The funders had begun pulling out, moving on to the latest hot thing in human rights, and it wasn't this. As a result, the school had started charging tuition for the first time, and while the tuition was much less than what we were seeing in other schools throughout Uganda, and it was just rice and beans, which I think by our California Western perspective wouldn't be seen as very much, these girls couldn't afford even that. So they told me that what some of them were doing was jumping the fence of the school at night, and they were going to the disco in town, and they were having sex with young men in order to get the rice and beans that they needed to pay for tuition. For me, this was suddenly an opportunity to see the unintended consequences of very good intentions. The very school that had been set up to deal with the fact that these women had been used as sex slaves was now actually, through the pullout of Western intervention, forcing them into the very practices that they were trying to recover from. So I asked the girls what they wanted, and they all wanted training in computers. There were no computers to be seen in day-to-day life up there in northern Uganda. However, a major tech company had come in a few years earlier and provided them with a state-of-the-art tech center. Let me show you the state of that state-of-the-art tech center when I arrived, oops, wrong direction, at the school. So this was the tech center, and that was the only computer I could actually find. While there had been a major donation given, and of course when I saw this, my first thought was, oh, I can go to Microsoft, or I can go to some other company, and I can get them to actually replenish this place. What I learned was, of course, the social and economic conditions had meant that a lot of outsiders had come into the school and, of course, stolen the equipment and sold it off. And the people who were profiting from that donation were not, in fact, the girls themselves. However, the girls did know that the future was going to be digital, and they wanted a piece of that. This is their library, and these are the 6 or 7 DVDs and the few VHS tapes that they had to teach them about the benefits of technology. In some ways, the mismatch between knowing technology has something to offer, a better future, is constrained by the fact and is challenged by context. 3 years later, in June 2018, I attended a workshop here at Stanford titled Human-Centered AI, Trust, Democracy, and Human Rights by Design. I'm guessing a few of you were probably also there. The opening talk had me absolutely riveted. It was a moderated conversation between Prince Zed, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and of course Sam Altman, president of Y Combinator and co-chair of OpenAI. The talk was striking to me for 2 reasons. First was the apparent gap between Zaid and Altman, with Zaid seeming skeptical of the utopian world that Altman was painting. Second, Altman's enthusiasm and certainty that technologists are on the cusp of having an algorithm capture every aspect of human experience, from thought to emotion, and therefore of achieving a near-perfect artificial intelligence that would benefit the globe. His thesis seemed to be that digital technologies can and are needed to fix the messy and unpredictable aspects of human experience. I couldn't help but wonder, especially as someone who teaches about research ethics, if this technology-driven urge to develop a perfect, albeit artificial intelligence to replicate human logic and thought and feeling was just an odd and new variation on something much older and that we had seen much earlier, that it might in some way be an odd form of eugenics for the 21st century. And while that might seem a bit provocative, I think there are some lessons learned that may be helpful to thinking through what comes next and what we can do to maximize, as David was talking about, the benefits of artificial intelligence and constraining some of the risks. The eugenics movement was, of course, an early 20th century attempt driven by the United States and later adopted by other countries, especially Nazi Germany, to perfect humanity. An unnerving yet innovative next step in the use of cutting-edge science in the name of progress. It was Francis Galton who coined the term eugenics in 1883. A British prodigy, I can't speak this morning, it's too early, and Charles Darwin's first cousin, he came from a family of gun manufacturers and bankers. He was obsessed with Darwin's Origin of the Species, which had hit the world when Francis was 37. He became driven to explore human variation and famous for his study of twins. This effort was eventually taken up by a man named Harry Laughlin. Harry was director of the U.S. Eugenics Record Office from 1910 until it closed in 1939 on the eve of World War II. Through his Center for Eugenics and Human Heredity, he designed a model law that he hoped every state in the U.S. would adopt. But they needed a test case so that if states did adopt their model law, this law wouldn't be invalidated by the U.S. Supreme Court. Meanwhile, he was regularly testifying on immigration policy, using science to show the statistically, quote-unquote, high levels of insanity in immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe who were flooding into the country at that time. He was ultimately awarded an honorary degree in 1936 for his science of racial cleansing. California, interestingly, became the one state to really jump on the actual practice of compulsory sterilization. In 1927, as they were traveling around the country to get more adoption of this model law, he had a chance to bring a test case. He got Virginia to adopt a statute based on his model, and he set his eyes on a young, poor, white Virginia woman named Carrie Buck. The new law mandated compulsory sterilization of persons who were deemed to be feeble-minded, used for a range of, quote-unquote, undesirables in society. Carrie Buck was 18 in 1924. She had been put into a Virginia state colony for epileptics and for the feeble-minded, and doctors requested to sterilize her, claiming she had a mental age of 9 and thus was a genetic threat to society. What was the evidence of this genetic threat? They claimed her mother, Emma, then 52, had the mental age of an 8-year-old. Evidenced by what they claimed to be a history of prostitution and immorality, and the fact that Emma had allegedly had a baby out of wedlock, they put her into an institution. Later, it would be found that, in fact, Emma had been married and her husband had abandoned her, leaving her alone with her daughter, Carrie. Emma was put into the facility, and Carrie was sent to adoptive parents who were relatives. At age 17, Carrie also had a child who her adoptive parents and the doctors claimed was also illegitimate, her baby Vivian, and as proof of a genetic defect in the family. Her doctors claimed she had a mental age of 9 and then asked to sterilize her, showing heredity of what they called at the time defective germ plasma that they claimed had been passed down through 3 generations, from Emma to Carrie to Vivian. The deck was stacked against her and is much a story about unethical lawyering as it is about the consequences of science and society. Looking to test the law's constitutionality, the colony superintendent, Albert Priddy, asked Buck's state-appointed guardian to appeal Carrie's sterilization order to the circuit court. Priddy hired Aubrey Strobe, who had actually drafted the sterilization law, to defend the colony, and Priddy arranged for a man named Irving Whitehead, a former colony board member and a sterilization supporter, to defend Carrie Buck. The defense attorney, Whitehead, did not call a single witness to argue for her side. When she lost, her defense attorney then appealed to the Virginia Supreme Court and then to the US Supreme Court, which was the ultimate objective. The holding was ultimately that the law was constitutional and she could be sterilized. Judge Oliver Wendell Holmes, one of our most lauded Supreme Court justices, wrote the decision, arguing that the interest of the states in a pure gene pool outweigh the interest of an individual in their bodily integrity. He declared, "We have seen more than once that the public welfare may call upon the best citizens for their lives. It would be strange if it could not call upon those who already sap the strength of the state for these lesser sacrifices, often not felt to be such by those concerned, to prevent our being swamped with incompetence. It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. The principle that contains compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover cutting the fallopian tubes." And he, of course, famously concluded by declaring that 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. Later, it was discovered just how much that deck had been stacked against her. Carrie and her daughter, later through historians, were found not to have been academically challenged, and in fact, there is some evidence that she had qualified for the honor roll. It was also found that she had not engaged in promiscuity, regardless of our thoughts on whether that should be punished or not. She had been raped by the man of the people who had adopted her, and as a way to save face for that young man and for their family, they had argued that she'd become impregnated through promiscuity. The case has never been expressly overruled, and these stories, of course, are not confined to poor white women, but extend to male prisoners and to both Black and Native American women who were affected by the laws that were passed. I can't help but wonder, what would the introduction of artificial intelligence mean today for a young woman like Carrie Buck? I think we have some sense in the burgeoning use in criminal sentencing and other forms of decision-making by states, where the potential of embedding biases in algorithms can be terrifying from a civil liberties perspective, at the same time that they can be used to counter the very human biases that are already a problem. Increasingly, as a result, actually, I'll save that for now. Increasingly, we're seeing ethics codes, sets of principles proliferate like they did in the wake of the eugenics age and scandals like Tuskegee, where a number of doctors went in the name of science to allow syphilis to progress among African American men in the South in order to better understand the progress of that disease, rationalizing that the harm to a few men and their wives and children was minor compared to the benefits of society. Artificial intelligence, of course, has the power to do tremendous good for this world. Some of the more recent successes, some of which has been documented by our artificial intelligence research team on child rights at UC Berkeley, there's a number of case studies about both positive and negative impacts. From the pluses and minuses of smart toys that can be used to help children with autism better understand the lessons that they're trying to learn, educational robots, to finding lost children with the help of facial recognition, to combing large quantities of war crimes footage to help gather the evidence that we need to bring perpetrators to justice at a scale that humans just can't manage given the proliferation of information online, The power of artificial intelligence to comb and sort and deduce from large quantities of data promises new insights about our world and the ways to manage hardship. However, we've also seen so many deployments already that have potential problems for humanity, whether unintended, as we saw in Uganda, or deliberate, as with the manipulation of science in the case of Carrie Buck. We have all read about the embedded biases in artificial intelligence. On the one hand, as I mentioned earlier, AI can check our human biases, but they can also magnify them, with deeply problematic results for equity and non-discrimination on the basis of gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation. One of the most chilling uses that the students on our AI and child rights teams identified was the use of artificial intelligence to detect behaviors and emotions of children in schools. What does it mean for children if not only their reactions to ideas that they're being taught in the classroom is being monitored, but their very emotional reaction to that content? What does it mean for risk-taking and the ability to push the parameters of future science if ultimately this kind of technology is used by authoritarian regimes, let alone democratic ones? On the flip side, how could this be harnessed to detect people at risk of suicide on social media and to intervene? Just a couple of weeks ago, a friend of mine was driving and she saw a man on a bridge cutting his wrists and about to jump. And she jumped out of her car, 2 other people did as well, and they prevented him from committing suicide. Can artificial intelligence combing social media for indicia of psychological distress become the digital equivalent of interventions like these? And I mean that question sincerely. I think there's reasons to say yes, and there are, of course, reasons to say no. Given the maxim that technology is neither good nor bad nor neutral, we are understandingly seeing these principles and codes of ethics being designed to help shape what happens next. However, these principles and codes, while important for shaping our thinking, are likely insufficient on their own to prevent and to remedy the harms of artificial intelligence. For one, there's no overarching ethical code or set of principles to which we can refer. Guidelines are helpful but piecemeal, and they risk fragmentation. As a result, we are beginning to see, with multiple articles coming out just last month, a call to use the human rights framework and its commitment to individual human dignity as an ethical guide, arguing that might be the most promising guide of all. Eileen Donahoe and Megan McDuffie-Metzger, in their April 2019 article on the topic of AI and human rights, point out the benefits of that existing framework for avoiding unintended negative consequences and fostering positive applications, including to support human dignity, democratic accountability, and the bedrock principles of free societies. As they explain, the existing universal human rights framework is well suited to serve this function and already has global legitimacy, offering several suggestions for how this might play out in practice. Also last month, Lorna McGregor, Vivian Ang, and Dara Murray, the co-editor of the book Digital Witness, similarly argue for using the human rights framework as a guide for algorithmic accountability. They note that using this framework requires an active role on the part of states to put in place an accountability framework that prevents violations from taking place, establishes monitoring and oversight mechanisms as safeguards, and provides a means to access justice for individuals and groups who claim their rights have been violated. It empowers individuals against states, and through the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, make sure that corporations also avoid overreach. Of course, the human rights framework is also insufficient without something more. Indeed, if we adopt human rights as a guide, that framework will be tested and already has been. It will bump up against incentive structures that prioritize profit over the broad distribution of the benefits engendered by AI. As part of that, it will also butt its head against intellectual property concerns, which mitigate for keeping algorithms in a black velvet box as corporate crown jewels. Of course, transparency is necessary to not only protect against bias and to make sure algorithms do what they're designed to do and what companies claim, but to engender trust. We cannot have a functioning society without trust. And this will, I suspect, be one of the most significant challenges of our age, learning how to trust an algorithm, and of course, first deciding if we should. The rise of AI has also, as so many scholars have pointed out, forced us to reckon with how we define intelligence. Multiple dictionaries espouse that there is no universal definition. One describes it as the ability to acquire and apply knowledge and skills, but others describe it more broadly as an ability to reach decisions. How do human beings reach decisions? The challenge, of course, is that it's not just logic. It's also emotion. There are probably aspects of instinct, and I would argue likely also biochemical aspects. How do we capture this in a set of variables? Perhaps the variables that go into these algorithms can be proxies for these things. By being fed enough data, AI can potentially reach similar conclusions around who will date, maybe even who will love, without needing access to the biochemical basis of attraction. But I'm skeptical. Buried in that skepticism, though, is both cynicism and hope. The hope is my deep belief that sometimes humans will be better than an algorithm, and a recognition that statistics capture patterns in data, but are never determinative for any individual. There was arguably a blind spot to the eugenics movement, one that doomed it to fail, and that's that a perfect human is a cultural construct, and therefore both contextual and mutable, and actually impossible. And maybe artificial intelligence will force us to break down the component parts of our biases, forcing us not only to be more aware of what those are, but to finally start confronting them. Perhaps in our quest to improve artificial intelligence-based technologies, we finally have a set of incentives to do so, including financial rewards if we get it right. What I also hope is that we've learned from our history of eugenics with the fallibility of science that was once considered infallible. For example, the touted benefit of radiation to make our teeth sparkling white, which compelled us to put it in our toothpaste, only to later realize we were poisoning our bodies. Hopefully this time we will learn more quickly, spotting when algorithms are putting us in danger versus helping us shine. Some of the questions we need to keep asking: do we want artificial intelligence to lead us to the answer humans would reach, just at greater speed and scale? Or do we want them to be a check to that? Do we want machines to decide without the insights that make us human? What is the best kind of intelligence we could produce? And as we grappled with during our history of eugenics and our effort to produce the best possible human, who decides what's best? As we test products and the use of those products, I think we should always be asking, what about the Carrie Bucks of the world or the teenagers of Padare Girls Academy? What will this mean for them? They live in a very different world than Prince Zaid and Sam Altman, and they have a lot they can teach us about how to operationalize our use of AI in the 21st century. In one of the classes I teach at Berkeley, Human Rights Research and Practice, we have a multi-class segment on human rights and new technologies. And I always end with a segment called Low-Tech Answers to High-Tech Problems. It's just a reminder that technology seduces us with her beauty and power. And it's a call to remember that we have far more in our toolboxes. Whether it's using things like falcons to knock drones out of skies because they're harder to hack, or it's using a rat to actually demine a community that's been hit by war because the technologies that we tried to produce can't detect plastics, and that the human beings that we've tried to use are too heavy and the dogs get distracted by squirrels and run off. Or whether it's thinking through the ways that old technologies can actually help us protect national security. I had one situation where I was asked to create a digital global archive, or to think through how that could be created to gather war crimes related footage that was going up on social media platforms. And I traveled all over the world looking at the models that might be feasible. And when I finally got to the Philippines at RightsCon back in 2015, I sat with one of the founders of the internet. And after a cup of tea and a bunch of chocolate and a long pause, he said, "Alexa, go find a cave somewhere obscure and bury that footage there." Last but not least, it's a reminder about the behavioral aspects of how we engage with new technologies. This is an example from the Netherlands, where they were having problems with a large quantity of people riding bicycles and a number of injuries that were happening when people would park their cars and open their car door and cyclists would go over the top and get hurt. They experimented with a number of new technologies to better signal to cars and drivers and cyclists when they were at risk. But what they found was ultimately most helpful was just training new drivers to open their door with their right hand and force them to look over their left shoulder. And it was a behavioral change that ultimately had significant impact. At the end of the day, as we embrace the benefits of big data and machine learning to find missing children, to predict outbreaks of conflict, and hopefully use that predictive power to prevent atrocities, we need to remember our objective and find the right tool to the right purpose. We have to ignore the pull of the shiny object, and finally we have to remember that the end use of these technologies will not be dictated by what is technologically possible, but by the context surrounding their use, and especially political will. We cannot ignore that human surrounding. When I worked with Eric Stover and Victor Peskin on the book Hiding in Plain Sight, we spent 6 years interviewing international investigators, prosecutors, diplomats, about how we can ultimately get arrests for the world's highest profile war crimes perpetrators, whether they're the presidents of countries or commanding generals. We had 3 people on our team, a lawyer, an operations person who was an on-the-ground investigator, and a political scientist. I expected we would find both challenges and opportunities through all 3 fields. As the lawyer on the team, what I was very humbled by was at the end of the day realizing that no matter how strong our legal frameworks, and no matter how great our operations and the technologies we bring to them, what was ultimately going to dictate whether these individuals went to prison was the politics around whether we could even getting to use those laws and use those operational tactics in the first place. I am personally very excited for a future in which I deeply believe that diversity will matter and that it will increasingly be seen as a strength and not a liability. Whether it's to improve the quality of training data used to train these algorithms, or the recognition that we need people from very different disciplines coming together to help us understand how to make these technologies and their uses strong. I think the future is very diverse, and it's filled with this aspect of multidisciplinarity. One of the number one things I think any engineering team can do right now is potentially bring on board a historian and potentially bring on board a psychologist who will help them understand that the way you react to social media content is very rarely logical and very often emotional. And we need to learn how to bake that into the very design of the products that we're producing. Ultimately, though, I do agree with Eileen Donahoe and others that we do have a framework in place to help us think this through. If artificial intelligence is really based around aggregating large quantities of data and finding patterns from that information, it's important that the check on that be a focus on individuals. And I think that in the wake of World War II in 1948, when we had to grapple with the ways that our best scientific and technological intentions had been perverted by politics to hurt humanity, and we put in place an international check on that tendency, that came in the form of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And of course, as many of you know, the bedrock and the core of that declaration is the need to uphold the individual and their individual dignity whenever we're looking at the use of different information in society. What is exciting is that it's already established, and it's something that I deeply believe we can use and begin to grapple with as we forge our way forward. Thank you so much.